Good morning.
Good morning.
That's a good one, Commissioner. Thank you. All right, we're going to get started. If y'all want to take your seats, I know others will be drifting in. So welcome to our annual ACC workshop. Any of you who have been through the ACC2 class recently, you may recall that Dr. Salchek has started to introduce different themes as a part of that leadership forum. One of those has been crisis management, and we've talked about how commissioners can lead during disasters when you are part of a larger team. What is your role in a disaster event? And so Dr. Salchek and I thought, who better to talk about that than Craig Fugate, our speaker today. And a lot of you know either Craig by name or by face. You'll see him on CNN during hurricane season. But Craig Fugate was the FEMA administrator for 8 years under President Obama. 8 years is a long time. I don't know, other than James Lee Witt, Craig, anybody else who's served that long? But he was also the State Division of Emergency Management Director under Governor Bush and Governor Christ. But what some of you may not know is he's actually a county person. He started out in Alachua County as a volunteer firefighter. He was a paramedic, a lieutenant in the Alachua Fire and Rescue, and then he was the emergency management director for Alachua County for about a decade. And I met Craig when I was a lowly staffer at the State Division of Emergency Management. He was brought in as the Bureau Chief of Preparedness and Response, and the person who hired him, Joe Myers, was the division director at the time, and I talked to Joe from time to time. He said he brought Craig in specifically because Craig could think outside the box. He wanted someone to think big. He wanted someone to think about the next type of disasters. And so Craig served the state well for nearly a decade, and then went on to bigger and better things. So I want to welcome Craig. He's going to talk to you about your role as a county commissioner and how you lead and work on a broader team. So Craig, thank you very much for coming, and welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Who wants to see a PowerPoint? Good, I don't have a PowerPoint. I figure I'd spare you. My experience on conferences, on the last day of the conference, if you got to look at one more PowerPoint, you're going to die. So no PowerPoint. And also, I got to thank Alachua County. I started out there. I grew up there. I'm from Alachua County. I can't say I was born and raised. My dad was in the Navy, so I was born up in Jacksonville. But my family's from there. I grew up. You can tell if you're really from Alachua County if you know the difference between Alachua County and Alachua, the city. You know, if you've ever been down to the Yearland restaurant, or you know where Micanopy is, you know, the Spring Arts Festival downtown, or if you've ever had your credit card say you went to a music store called Lillian's, you're from Gainesville or Alachua County. So I got my start there. I started out as a paramedic. Everybody, you know, kind of wondered how I got into this business. I said I answered my phone. It was interesting when I got to Alachua County. It was then Alachua County EMS. Alachua County, people don't understand this. They don't know this, but we were one of the 4 communities selected by the Department of Transportation for early grant funding. And there's a name that if you're from Alachua County, if you're old enough, you'll understand who this is. It's P.Z. Stevens used to have a contract where he bought up all the funeral home ambulances services, created Alachua Ambulance Service, got the DOT grant, and had the first advanced life support on the road. We had the first 911 in the state of Florida. People think, well, that, you know, all these other big city stuff. No, Alachua County is pretty progressive, not just as a blue state, but as far as those things go. So when I got there, we were primarily volunteer firefighters and a county EMS service. But as our county grew, like a lot of you, we reached a point where the volunteers could no longer keep up with the load, and we were getting development outside of the small communities. So I got right on the ground floor as we converted over to doing fire rescue. So I was one of those first supervisors hired. I've been in the field all that time, and I was a lieutenant. Just got hired as lieutenant fire rescue, and at that time our director decided that as you make your first rung of management, you needed some experiences besides your street experiences. So we were all given assignments. So I get this phone call, I answer the phone, and I was asked to do one of 3 projects, one of which was updating the county's disaster plan. And I had been taking some online courses at the University of Cincinnati. I said, yeah, that's great, I'll do that. I can remember it was a 2-week assignment. It was in February of 1987. And I came in and I had to brief a new county commissioner, and people from Alachua County will recognize this name. Of course, she's pretty infamous. People recognize this name everywhere. Penny Wheat was a new county commissioner, and Bob Fernandez was our county manager. And I had the job of briefing her about the program. And there's a reason to this story, because I had to figure out what exactly is emergency management and the county's responsibility. And I was told to go brief this new commissioner. I had no idea who there was. I'd never met the county manager. I hadn't even met county commissioners. I was like one of these people that lived on the road. So now I'm downtown. I'm in the county commission building. Before they enclosed the bottom floor, we were in the basement. And so I start reading Chapter 252, the State Emergency Management Act. Any of you have any friction between some of your municipalities and the counties over governance roles and day-to-day activities? We have a city in Alachua County that thinks they are a county. I won't mention the city, but there is always a natural tension, particularly if you have a large municipality and a county government, and you got that border fringe where you're both providing municipal services and you're fighting over annexation and taxes and stuff. And there had always been this tension there. So I'm reading Florida Statute 252, and I get to the county part, the duties of the political subdivisions. And you know what it said? It said the county shall, not maybe, not if it's convenient, the county shall have a program and shall serve all of the political subdivision. And there was no carve-outs for municipalities. When you get down to the municipal level, it says municipalities are encouraged to have programs. But municipalities must go through the counties in coordinating and requesting assistance and mutual aid during disasters. I found that fascinating, because sure enough, the folks over at this other city had never read that. Because they kept telling me, well, they wanted to have all the contact information for the state and state warning point so they could call them direct. And I'm like, they're just going to reroute you back to us. And I can remember going to the school board. School board found opening shelters up inconvenient. And so they had made a decision, they were getting out of the shelter business. And again, I'm still like brand new to this profession. This is like the first couple of months after I did the briefing for the county commissioner. The county manager turned to public safety and says, who is this guy and why haven't I met him before? They said, well, he's one of your new lieutenants in fire rescue. And he says, well, seems he could do a lot better doing this full time. So I never went back on the road. I mean, I literally went from being a paramedic to reading the statute and getting my hand on anything I could. So I get called into this meeting with the school board. They got all these attorneys, their risk management folks, their emergency coordinator, the superintendent of the schools, everybody's there, and it's just me. And they're basically telling me we're not doing shelters anymore. And I said, well, excuse me, that's not what the law says. And the attorney says, what do you mean? I said, well, it says right here in Chapter 252 that school districts at the direction of the county and declared emergency will provide facilities, equipment, and shelters, buses. There's no exclusion. You don't get to opt out. Attorney says, he goes up and grabs the law book, brings down Chapter 252, opens up, reads it, looks at the superintendent, and says, we're in the shelter business. The reason I tell you these two stories is Florida is a county-centric state. We are not a city-centric state. Most Northerners have no earthly idea what the hell I'm talking about when I say that. It confuses Washington, D.C. immensely, because they're always trying to do direct funding to cities, and I'm like, cities are not necessarily where the authorities lie. So the first thing I learned is you got to know what the legal basis in dealing with disasters are. And guess what? Chapter 252 is actually written in English. It's pretty straightforward. They keep adding to it. They did something I ain't really thrilled about. They did take away some of your authorities when it's not a hurricane or other natural hazard, although I would argue they wrote that wrong because a virus is a natural event. But they did do some tweaking where they've decreased your ability for public safety measures if the public finds it inconvenient, except for a hurricane. You can still throw them out of their homes. But masking and quarantining and stuff like that, they're basically saying as long as nobody complains, you can do it. If they complain, we'll override you. That got added. But short of that, have you actually read your authorities of what you can do? It's not a long read. It's only a couple of paragraphs. And the way I would read it, and I would always make sure you have an county attorney that gets this, because if they don't, find you a new one. You want a county attorney that reads that and knows that unless it's expressly prohibited, it's possible in a disaster. Because the way 252 was written was you can never anticipate every scenario. But you should read it, understand it, because I don't care if you've delegated your emergency management program to another constitutional. I'm agnostic about that. You can designate somebody as your emergency management director. You always have the responsibility for what's in that statute. And all of the authority is there for you. I probably had this impression when I first got into business that you as elected officials are best kept out of my EOC and out of my way when I'm running my job. But the more I got to do this, the more I understand I have no inherent authority. In Florida, the only authority to declare emergencies or have emergency powers is vested in elected leadership. It is not vested in appointed officials. Appointed officials sometimes make the mistake of thinking they have that. Unless you have delegated it to them, they have no original authority to declare an emergency, take emergency actions, do all the stuff that you can do. That originates with you. And if you designate that to a constitution, guess what? That constitution does not have that original authority. Only the county commission does. So as you look at your ordinances of how you implement that, that's another key part. Who can declare emergencies? It's practical to delegate that down for fast-moving events like chemical emergency, train derailments, where you don't have the luxury of getting the board together and having a formal process to, in those situations, designate either the chair of the commission or, depending upon your form of government, if you have a chief executive, if you have an elected mayor, but getting it to somebody who can singularly make that decision, because the board can always then come back and override it. And you do it at 7-day intervals. But those authorities are not in the professional staff. They execute that authority on your behalf. And I think this is something mentally it's important for everybody to understand. In Florida, only the elected officials. And in this case, under Chapter 252, it's the city commission, the county commission, and the governor. That's it. There are a lot of constitutionals think they have emergency powers. Within their statutes they do, but not under 252. None of the other state constitutionals have those authorities. And when it comes to disasters, and if FEMA comes in, the authority to engage in that assistance program comes back to who's got taxing authority. Because when you're doing those agreements with FEMA and you're signing on those projects, the authority signing is guaranteeing the match and must have the authority and the budget authority to do that, whether it's to raise taxes, issue bonds, or borrow money. How many of your constitutionals have taxing authority? The only entities in the counties that have taxing authority are the county commissioners, the city commissioners, the school district, your water management districts, and whatever's left of special districts that haven't been annihilated, taken over, or somehow newly created at the direction of the Florida legislature. For a state that was proud to be locally driven, our state legislature has some strange ideas what local means. But, and so this is your framework. And don't depend upon people telling you what your authorities are. Because I've been on this other end where people would brief me on what they wanted me to know and what they wanted me to hear. And I have, if I'm an elected official, I have a constitutional duty to understand these authorities, make sure that they're explained to me, and don't just accept why I can or cannot do something because somebody's interpretation. Eric will tell you in the state of Florida, we were under all of these things we couldn't do because the state comptroller wouldn't allow it. Well, we finally challenged that one time. You know, in the State Emergency Operations Center, we couldn't even buy coffee because the state comptroller said we weren't on travel, therefore we couldn't get per diem, and therefore we couldn't buy coffee. I'm like, if you've ever tried to run our Emergency Operations Center for 24 hours without coffee, and there was no Starbucks out there at that point. And General Milligan was the state comptroller. So we made the ask. Turned out that was somebody's opinion. General Milligan said, we take care of our folks. So always challenge when people tell you we can't do something. Remember, 252 was written that unless it's expressly prohibited in statute, it's possible. So a lot of times people will tell you, well, we can't do it because they don't want to do it. It's not easy. So again, as a new commissioner, as an existing commissioner, read Chapter 252. The authorities, duties of the county commission. And understand that. Because the next part goes back into disasters. The role of the county commission. I'm going to tell you that it is what I would call, during the response, the least of your work. Because if you've done your job on the front end, making sure that your county professionals have built the team, they know what their expectations are, you've given them the guidance. And again, I know money's tight, so I'm not asking you to give money. But at least make sure they know what the expectations are and what they're supposed to accomplish. Because I hear a lot of people say, I don't have the staff, don't have the money. I'm like, really? When have I ever had the staff or the money? This is a true story. When I was first in that job, after they put me in there permanently, we were going through some fiscal problems in the late 80s, if you remember that, early 90s. And I sat in the county commission meeting where they were flashing everybody's budgets up on the screen and telling us the cuts we had to make. And when I looked at the number up there, it was less than my salary. So I asked a question, wasn't really appreciated. I said, well, since you guys are basically not funding my position, can I leave now? Because they don't make much sense to me doing a budget if I'm not going to be here. I was told by the county manager, quit being a smart, whatever. But I went through sequestration at FEMA. Do you realize from 2009 till I walked out the door, we cut the operational budget of FEMA 25%? Did you see any difference in our response? So I don't have a lot of sympathy for people whining about they don't have enough money or resources. So.
Greg, spoke about the authority between the county commission and the school board. You were instrumental in helping the last county university. Can we talk about the authority between the county commission and the university system?
Oh yeah, that's a fun one. County commissioners have authority on the political subdivision. You don't have authority over state entities. So when we were dealing with Irma, Governor Scott declared a statewide emergency, closed all the universities. Universities somehow got the impression that was, oh good, we'll shut down and secure and we're done. Well, that's not why they closed you. We were looking at huge evacuations and we had no real understanding where the population was going. And certain universities, not to be mentioned, decided they were opting out of sheltering the general population because they stink, they're poor, they'll mess stuff up, they'll foul our good name. But we'll take our staffs and our students on campus and y'all just worry about the rest of them. Well, it turns out, town and gown, I've been doing this for a long time, found out the way I work around that. Yeah, I have no tasking authority over a state university, but the governor does. And so if I need a university in my county or college or any other state institution to support an operation, I put my request to the State Emergency Operations Center to get them tasked. And they can't ignore that one because the governor's authorities over everything that's not federal or tribal. The two authorities we don't have in the state of Florida is on federal or federally recognized tribes. Mississippi, Seminole tribe are not under state jurisdiction and declared emergencies. But everything else is. In fact, one of the things you'll read in the governor's power, you and all of your staff are considered part of the state emergency response force and can be moved around as needed. But that authority, again, is you're over the political subdivisions. You have tasking authority to the school board for shelters. But the state university system, the state colleges, or state institutions, but you can get that resource through a request to the state. And they can then task them, and then it's like they got to do it. But again, remember I said a lot of times staff don't want to do something because it's inconvenient, hard work, or causes more problems. It don't mean it's not possible. So I don't really take no as an answer. I got a problem I need to solve. Maybe I'm asking the question wrong, but how do I resolve the problem? So that's how I try to get people to approach things. But your job, once you understand the authorities and responsibilities, is to assure the professional staff understand the expectations and how you want things put together, run, and operated. Now, the professional staff, again, I was part of that. They know process, they know policy within their programs, but I'm amazed at how many don't know their communities. And the other thing that I find that when the professional staff are given problems to solve is they solve them what I call government-centric problem solving. And they forget there's a lot of other resources in the community that ain't part of government, like the private sector, the businesses, and the public. One of the things I did when I was leaving the division, when I got to FEMA, I instituted is I said, quit calling people victims in a disaster. They're survivors, and they ain't waiting on you. And in most cases, they're taking care of themselves and their neighbors faster than you can get out the door. And there's this tendency within the professional staff to see the public as a liability. You need to keep them out of the way. They're not trained. They haven't taken the incident command system. And they're somehow unworthy of helping their neighbors. Well, they ain't asking for your permission. They're going to do it anyway. And so the thing that, again, when we talk about the broad stuff is make sure the professional staff understands the population of my county are part of the response team. Those that can help will help. Those that need help will ask for it. We fill in the gaps. The bigger the disaster, the slower the government response is going to be, and the harder it's going to be to get to everybody. I'll give you a good example. Joplin had a tornado go through in Missouri. It was about as bad as they get. It was on the Fugate scale, an F5 slab. Except the slab was about basically from a half a mile to 2 miles wide and 15 miles long. 10 miles of it was nothing but slab. There was nothing standing. It was so strong that the hospital it hit actually twisted the steel frame of a 5-story hospital and destroyed it. So it's one of these disasters where the president goes. So we're about 4 days into it. POTUS comes in. We're doing what they call a street walk. And again, if you ever dealt with a tornado, it's very clear edges between total devastation to it looks almost normal. And we're on the street where on one side, the houses had missed shingles, awnings, and had stuff like you would expect with a Cat 1 hurricane or an F0 like we get in the summertime from tornadoes. And the other side was like, not much left. We're coming past this house. There's a gentleman standing on the porch. He's an elderly gentleman. He had this really beautiful baby blue Chevy pickup, like 1958, 59 pickup truck. It was gorgeous. And he's in his yard, and the president says, sir, can I come up and talk to you? He says, yeah, come on in. Of course, you got all the press and everybody else. And POTUS both him and Bush were very good about getting the handlers to stay away. And so he drugged me up there so I could answer any questions. And he went up and started talking to gentlemen. He said, sir, were you here when it happened? He said, yeah, and he tells the story. It's pretty chaotic. The back house of this house is gone. Really, the only thing left is the front porch and the door going into the living room and part of a kitchen, and everything else is gone. And so the president was like, "What? Well, what'd you do?" And he said, "Well, I hid, came out, everything's destroyed." And the president's just like, the devastation's just incredible. And he's like, "So what did you do? What did you do after that?" And the guy looked at the president, well, I started helping my neighbors. They were screaming for help. And the president said, "That's incredible." And he looks at me and I'm like, "Sir, 90% of the people that got rescued in Joplin got rescued by bystanders and neighbors. By the time the first urban search and rescue teams got here, we'd already done the primary search for the public. We only rescued 2 live people the second day when the teams got there." So that's why I think it's important that we understand that the public, whether they're the Cajun Navy version of taking their boats out, or whether they're 4-wheel drive enthusiasts that can get down roads that nobody else can get down because their vehicles won't get down there, they're afraid they're going to scratch the paint, or just something as simple as during heat waves, checking on neighbors. You'll never have enough staff to do that. So the public's a resource. Don't call them victims, call them survivors. Victims are the ones we lost, we mourn, but the survivors are part of the team. Second thing is the private sector. Too often, government goes to the private sector and says, "We need you to do something to me." When's the last time that your staff have gone out to your major employers and major distributors of goods like your big box stores, your pharmacy, stuff like that, and asked this question: what can we do to get you open? The question is usually, what can you do for us? A better question is, what can we do to get you open? Because every time you can get a store open, that's one more distribution point you're not having to build logistics around, right? Well, I went and asked, I said, what's the biggest challenge? I've talked to Walmart, Publix, we dealt with this a lot after 2004. You know what the biggest problems for us getting open is? Curfews. I'm like, curfews? What? They said, we do logistics at night. We ship all our supplies at night. We make our repairs at night. We got a lot of people that are contractors coming in. Generally, if the truck says Publix, they got waved in. But the guy that was showing up in the middle of the night to go fix the compressor on the refrigerator unit didn't have a uniform on and was told to go home. We're under a curfew. And the other thing was, we couldn't agree upon curfews even in a county when every municipality, especially those that have multiple cities with multiple police departments, were running different curfews and had different rules of engagement. Permitting. After 2004, Publix made the decision, and they couldn't implement this because we got hit too quick in 2005. They were going to install new generators at every one of their grocery stores in the hurricane belts to run the whole store. Because previously, they only had generator power to run the emergency stuff, but after losing those freezers multiple times, they figured it was cheaper to put in a big generator, run the whole store, and not have to go through that mess. When they went to go do permitting, guess what they ran into? Some of our codes enforcement folks are very process-oriented. And in the case of, like, how many parking spots you're supposed to have at that store, if they put in that big generator, they weren't going to get a new parking lot. It took up 5 parking spaces. Guess what? The permit for that generator got denied. Because the code said you got to have X number of parking spots for a grocery store of that size. And nobody can get around the fact that, does that even make sense? They're putting in the big generator to run the whole store, so next disaster, they're open. So that's why when we go to the private sector, I think we got to make sure our professional staff understands. And you guys, as you run for elections, you have relationships with the chambers and the business community, right? We should be asking our employers and our distributors and suppliers and stores, what do you need to get open? Because if they can get open quickly, it resolves a lot of issues. This is, and really what set this up was when Governor Bush was down after Hurricane Wilma. He was down in Miami. It was one of the biggest power outages we've ever faced in the state before we got Hurricane Irma. And we had made all these assumptions after 2004, and this is what I call government-centric problem solving. Our assumption was power was out, stores were closed, we needed to get water, food, and ice down there. Except we were covering everything from Key West to Okeechobee County to Lee County, but the big ones, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. That's huge populations. Yet we were operating as if the state had to do this. So Governor Bush calls me up and says, hey, Craig, I'm down at one of the points of distribution somewhere in Miami. He says, things are going good. You know, lines moving, National Guard's handing out food, water, and ice. People seem pleased, except they're eating fast food and they just bought their groceries at Publix and you're in the Publix parking lot. I'm like, well, that ain't good. And it caused us to rethink. And it turned out Publix was open because they put a generator in there. There was no power, but when we started calling around, it turned out only about 5 of the big box stores were closed in those 3 county areas. So we were actually competing with the private sector at something they do better than us. And because we were competing with the private sector and trying to get to the big populations, we missed the most vulnerables. You know where we should have been setting up all those points of distribution? In Pahokee and Belglades, where the IGA was closed, there was no big box, and people were driving 30 to 40 miles to get help. Because we went to the big populations first, because that's where the big demand was going to be, but we didn't know, because we were so focused on what government did, that we never coordinated with any of the big box stores. Were you guys open? Lesson learned, I brought this to FEMA. Before we start shipping everything in, find out if they're open. And if they can get open, that's not where we need to be. We need to be where they can't get open, or there's no presence. So that's something that, again, as a board, as a commissioner, you can impress upon your professional staff. They don't always like it. They don't like working with volunteers because it's inconvenient. They don't like working with the private sector because it's not always convenient. It's like, disasters aren't convenient. That's just the nature of life. But you've got a lot of resources in your community. You got the public, you got the private sector. How much does that cost you? That's just a little coffee, a couple meetings, and showing up and talking to folks, right? And think about your connections into your communities that your professional staff generally don't have. The outreach you have to underserved community parts that don't necessarily show up on these things. So that's the first thing. Second thing is getting people to understand time and that disasters are not big emergencies. The reason we have emergency management is because the org chart of your county government sucks in a disaster. And you people look at me like, what? Think about it. The org chart of county government is not built to respond to fast-moving crises and disasters. That's why you declare an emergency and you set up an EOC, you bring everybody in, and you work as a team. Because if you can resolve it in the org chart, you don't need to declare a state of emergency. I mean, how many times you've had a really big fire? You got a fire department, you got mutual aid, you handled it through the org chart. And the goal is to get things back in the org chart. You don't want to stay in indefinite states of emergencies forever. You want to get to where you normalize an event and get it back into the day-to-day running of government. And so a lot of times people think, well, disasters are just a big emergency and we'll just keep scaling up. How well did that work in Hurricane Katrina? Because that was the FEMA plan. FEMA had done an exercise with the state that spring. The exercise was actually worse than Katrina. And when they did the exercise, every time an issue came up, FEMA says, we got that, we got that, we got that. Well, FEMA ain't got nothing. But they thought, well, if it's bad, we'll just scale up. We'll do more of what we're always doing. Didn't work. You either go big or you go home. In a disaster, you've either built for the big events or you didn't. There's no in between. And so there's a tendency, especially among the emergency services folks and the law enforcement community, to treat disasters like, well, that's just a big emergency. We're going to do what we've always done, and we'll send a liaison to your EOC to say we're there. Well, emergency services, quite honestly, is the smallest part of any response to disaster, and quite honestly, after 72 hours, they're basically not that critical. Your public works are your big dogs in a lot of these disasters. Your social services, community services, all the stuff that doesn't have lights and sirens, they actually have more roles in disaster. But I would venture to bet when you do disaster exercises, or your county says they do disaster exercises, they've actually exercised the emergency response. Because they think disasters are big emergencies, and they don't understand the difference. Disasters about people, about disruption of infrastructure, about things that the org chart of government won't be able to resolve doing what they've always done, just faster and bigger. And people don't get that. And it's sort of like, it's hard to explain to people. Once you see it, you understand it. But again, people need to get to this point. This is, I think, the hardest thing to do. And that is recognize that an event is occurring. You know, you got a big hurricane, Cat 5 coming in, it's pretty easy to go. This is going to be a disaster. On these smaller events, they kind of creep up on you, and you end up backing into it. But it's recognizing early that what we were prepared to do is not going to work, and we need to do something different. And that's where your tools come in under that State Emergency Management Act, because you got tools in there when you declare an emergency you don't have for day-to-day governance. The day-to-day org chart of dealing with things, the way that routine has addressed it. It doesn't mean that those routine events aren't deadly and costly. It's that we built for them. And understanding that difference and getting to what I call that tipping point, because I think sometimes people think declaring emergencies we do pretty lightly, but there's a lot of repercussions. And there are things within those emergency authorities we don't always utilize, but we can. But understanding that point and making sure the professional staff understand that, hey guys, if we're not sure, if we think this is worse than we think, if we think this is going to be going faster, we need to change what we're doing. We need to activate our plan, we need to get everybody in the EOC, and we need to work as a team. We're not going to solve this as a collection of agencies on the org chart. That was how Florida responded to Hurricane Andrew. People blame FEMA, but the state of Florida and Governor Charley stood up and said we were as much of a problem. But Florida responded to Hurricane Andrew as a collection of state agencies, hoped it add up. It didn't add up. We responded to 4 hurricanes in 2004 and another 4 in 2005 with fewer people than we had in 1992 for Hurricane Andrew. And people say, how did you do that? It was called the State Emergency Response Team. We didn't respond as a collection of agencies. We responded as the state. We had all of the state agencies, all of the unimpacted counties, municipalities, and mutual aid from other states. That's what we did. But hurricanes, I think, quite honestly, are easy. Remember how confusing it was when COVID started? And the initial response to COVID was the org chart. Public health emergency. And I won't even get into the controversies over masking up, hey Marcia, or vaccinations or any of that other stuff, curfew stuff. Just think about how fast that COVID was moving, that as you were dealing with the public health stuff, you started dealing with other consequences that had nothing to do with what public health did. Yet, in that event, who was the lead agency? Public health. But the problem was we didn't see quick enough that this was turning from a public health emergency into a community disaster. We were going to start seeing unemployment like we'd never seen before. We were going to start seeing impacts to populations because of lack of resources couldn't get out that were detrimental, and we were going to have to step in. And that wasn't what public health had planned for. And quite honestly, that's not what they do. But that's an example of some counties got there faster than others. Some states got there faster than others. Federal government didn't get there fast enough to recognize the plan we had built to respond to COVID was a public health model. And the assumption was it would stay in the public health bubble. But as we saw with COVID, it didn't stay there. And also the other thing is, if you think about it, most of our public health models deal with like a flu. That was like was supposed to be 6 to 8 weeks, not 2 years. So that's an example of how when people were looking at something, they're going, we got a plan for that, we have an agency for that, that's the org chart, until it didn't work. And those that got there quicker were more successful. Those that got there later, it was more painful. I've seen this, again, my home county. We had an ice storm. You don't think of ice storms in Florida, but guess what? We had so much sleet on I-75, we had to shut it down from basically the Georgia state line to Ocala. I-10 from Pensacola to Jacksonville. We had people all over stranded. We were sending fire trucks on the road. The fire trucks would get up their parks, try to help people, and turned out the weight of the truck would start melting the sleet and they'd be sliding off the road. Of course, the people from Ohio laughed at us, put on their chains, and kept driving. But we backed into that, and what we didn't recognize was we had a disaster. We thought we were responding to traffic conditions because everything was going on up on the interstate. Nobody was paying attention to the fact, oh, guess what? we got a power generation capacity shortfall across the state because the nukes are offline for maintenance, and we just lost a plant, and now we're doing rotating brownouts, which turn out to be blackouts, and there's no rotating about it. We got temperatures going for several days below freezing temperatures. I don't know about you, but Gainesville ain't a very comfortable place when it doesn't get above 32 degrees for 2 or 3 days. And again, we were thinking we were dealing with an emergency. We were responding to 911 calls. Problem was, when you're getting calls on 911 from the residents, it's beyond an emergency. You're dealing with a disaster. We ended up having to house people. And you didn't think about this. What happened to all those people that were stranded on the interstate, couldn't go anywhere? Remember when I said the public's a resource? Guess who rescued them? Local churches and farmers. Because in the north end of my county, they realized people were trapped. So they got the tractors, hooked up the wagons, threw hay up on them. Tractors could actually do pretty good on those icy roads, plus they could drive up and down the medians. And they were picking people up, taking them back to the fellowship hall of local churches where the church had come in. They were making coffee, making soup, and fed them. We found out about that 2 days later. Nobody called us up and said, hey, you need to rescue people off the interstate. They just did it. But we had all these pieces, and we missed opportunities, and we saw a lot of impacts in our community. Yet our public became the first response to get people off the interstate. So that understanding the difference between what our plan says and the org chart and how we deal with a lot of events, and then recognizing that isn't going to work. Your EOC, I try to get people to think about this. If you've got a good EOC and a good staff, they're what I call a problem-solving engine. They're going to solve stuff that we're used to that's in the plan, they're going to accomplish, but the stuff that never happened before, they've never seen, that's where you want your best and brightest. You do not want to have the liaisons from the constitutionals with no authority in there. You don't want the agencies sending the people they can spare in there. And in a disaster response, one of the things county commissioners can do is be visible. Because if you're there, your department heads go, oh crap, I better be there, right? Now, I learned this from General Burnett, presence is submission. A lot of times, most of your work, I said, is going to be before the disaster, setting the expectations of what the program needs to be, and you're going to be doing a lot of work after in the recovery. But during the disasters, presence is the mission. You got staff to run stuff. Depending upon your county, if you're the chair, you may be the spokesperson in doing the briefings. Your job's not to get in the way of the professional staff, but trust me, when Governor Bush showed up at the EOC, we got agency heads. When Governor Bush wasn't in the EOC, I got who they could spare. So Governor Bush showed up in the EOC every time we had a big disaster. I got yelled at by some of the secretaries going, hey, I didn't know the governor's going to be there. I'm like, it was called the governor's hurricane exercise. What do you expect? So the other thing is, when you're doing an exercise, a big one, show up and just watch. And make sure what you're hearing matches what your expectations are, and that you're listening for gaps in what the community is going to need versus what your staff are doing. Again, that role during the actual event is minimal, but your presence is a big piece of that. The hard work is the recovery. And that's going to be years, if not decades. And that's where, again, you don't want to get so engaged in response, you're not forward looking, because you got, basically, before the disaster is the vision of what the program should be and the expectations of the authorities you're delegating. But in the aftermath of the disaster, where are we going? And these are going to be policy and political decisions that only the board can make. Because there's going to be a lot of people going to go, rebuild, rebuild, rebuild. Rebuild where? Rebuild how? What's our priorities? What's the funding? What are we doing about revenue? Before the disaster, I'm going to tell you a blunt answer you may not like. Do not depend upon the state or federal government paying your bills for the first 60 days. You need to have a line of credit, and it needs to be probably 2 to 3 times your existing budget. Because when you get the first debris bills, you have a prompt pay law in Florida. right? But in the aftermath of the disaster, when you got federal funds, you got HUD funds, you probably got more money you know what to do with initially. Hopefully you thought about this. But how do you rebuild? And putting staff back where it was the same way that got destroyed in the disaster, just setting you up to do it again. Second thing you need to be really focused on, if you got any type of water that's desirable, you ain't going to come back the way it was. You're going to see such rapid gentrification that people are going to wonder what happened. Have anybody driven past Mexico Beach since Hurricane Michael hit it? What's there now? It's all short-term rentals, vacation homes, and non-permanent residents. That's actually, from the standpoint of emergency management, not a bad deal. It means during hurricane season, very few people are at risk. It means from your tax base, basically people paying a lot of money with very low demand for services. It's very desirable. What happened to people that lived in Mexico Beach, though, before? Where are they at now? They're priced out. They couldn't afford to rebuild, they didn't have insurance, or they rebuild, they can't afford the insurance. They got priced out. The question that everybody asks is, what did we do about them? And a lot of people say, well, what could we do? Well, market forces are going to drive the rapid gentrification. I don't think you can fight that. But the thing you got to be thinking about is workforce housing. I'm not talking about affordable housing. I'm talking about workforce housing. How many right now in your county, your new hires, cannot afford to buy a home in your county? That's workforce housing. And guess what? After disasters, it exponentially gets worse. So thinking about rebuilding, you don't want to start the day a disaster happens. You want to start thinking about where do we need to prioritize? Where does it make sense to rebuild? And again, insurance is going to start driving this because people can't afford flood insurance if they're buying brand new in a lot of communities with the new prices. However, that person buying that secondary home, that short-term rental, that vacation home, they'll pay for that to be near the water. So in some ways, we're pricing risk to change behavior, but not necessarily in a way that people like. But that's what happens. If we're going to deal with the changes that are occurring, there's going to be pain here. But what you need to be thinking about is when the money starts flowing, and you've got HUD dollars coming down, community block grant disaster, which will take you about 2 years to see the light of day. You got FEMA rebuilding grants. You got people getting their insurance payoffs. You need to be thinking, again, have we set the stage with our zoning? Have we set the stage with our codes enforcement to get in and address this? One of the things that is really critical is the immediate impact, the homes, and getting repairs made. One of the reasons why FEMA does a blue roof program is to get people out of shelters. They have this under emergency authority. But guess what? You can do the same thing. You can actually repair homes and get reimbursed by FEMA up to 75% of those costs. But here's what we know. In homes that are damaged in disasters, not destroyed, but are damaged, if you don't get them dried out and power back on within the first week, their chance of survival goes down the drain. It takes FEMA and the Corps of Engineers to turn the blue roof program on in 2 weeks. You have authority under an emergency, and I did this in Alachua County. We got hit during a tornado and a bunch of wind events, and I got asked by the county commission, could we go make repairs? I said, yeah. They hired one of their contractors that they had on retainer that they do for small repairs and stuff like that, construction. We started fixing homes, and FEMA reimbursed us 75% of that. Homes that are damaged that can be saved, you got about a week. And it's unlikely that federal programs will kick in and do what needs to be done. But if you lose that home, it ain't coming back. Because if it gets rebuilt, think about how much of that is now rental property. And what's happened to rental rates in your community. But if I have a home that's heavily damaged and I repair it, and I live out in Fort Clark, and I'm renting that home for, let's say, $2,000 a month, and I just spent $100,000 replacing the roof, putting things back up and getting everything repaired, am I going to be renting that for $2,000 a month after that? If the market will afford it, I'm going to $3,000. And I just price people out. But if I can save that home early, I keep it in the market. So Again, there are 3 big areas. Pre-event, understanding authorities, making sure the professional staff understand what the expectations are, making sure they treat the public and the private sector as part of the team. During the event, less activity, but presence is critical. Going out in your community and looking and coming back and telling the county what you're seeing. Because what they don't know, they can't fix. You're going to have constituents come up that they never heard of before that have issues. They need to know that. Your presence, though, and that EOC is the legitimacy of your authority delegated to that professional staff. And then in the aftermath, it is the leadership of a long, grueling, and painful process of rebuilding your community. But please, just don't put it back the way it was, because you're going to be replacing it again. And tax base is what you live and die by. So your goal here is to make sure that your tax base is growing, because your demand for services will be going up. Every type of county service that you have after a disaster skyrockets. Even your EMS calls go up. You know, more people usually die in Florida after the hurricane than they do from the storm, except for Ian, because we didn't have evacuations of some of the areas that were very vulnerable. People didn't leave. But your EMS calls go up, domestic abuse goes up, graduation rates go down, drug addiction goes up, substance abuse across the board. And think about that. Where's that in the disaster plan? So you have a lot of authorities. You can build good programs. You can hold professional staff to these expectations. And trust me, just letting them know you care and this is important to you is 90% of the game, because you empower them to step out of their box. Because this is the one thing I've learned a long time ago. I tell people when I go talk to emergency managers, I say, how many of you consider yourself reasonable people? Everybody raises their hand and says, you're going to really suck at this. Because you got to get people to do stuff they don't want to do. You got to get people to do exercises they don't want to go to. You got people that have to go to meetings. I got other stuff, other priorities. I got my day-to-day world to go with. I got to convince people, because in my world, I'm not asking to give emergency managers more money. They operate under what I call OPM. It's other people's money. You're funding a lot of other agencies. And again, your emergency management staff aren't going to do everything. Again, your heavy hitters, your public works. They're probably the biggest piece of your immediate response. Yes, ma'am.
So, I haven't heard you address maybe this is but I represent Pinellas County and 35 miles of beaches. And for 50 years, we've been dealing with the Army Corps, the ACC Beach Renourishment. And right now, there's a policy law attorney in D.C. that has said we're not going to do that anymore. And our beaches are our biggest economic driver, not only from Pinellas, but now there are about 11 or 12 other counties around our state dealing with the same thing. So, it also is, we have the coastal erosion line. I mean, what else can we do? That's our protection against hurricanes and rising water, so on and so forth.
Having dealt with improved and unimproved beaches across Florida, beach renourishment, and the cost, here's how it comes across on the federal level. And this isn't to say this isn't important, but from the standpoint of the federal taxpayer, you just said it. This is an economic issue. From the standpoint of the federal taxpayer in Montana, why am I paying for the economics of Pinellas County? Why isn't the state and Pinellas County paying for that? I get it if it's life safety. I get it if it's infrastructure. But from the standpoint of if beaches are purely economic, this is a policy question. And again, you're dealing with this, but this is what's happening in Washington. You saw that little fight they had about raising the debt ceiling limit? So these are policy questions people are asking from states who don't have beaches. If it's economic, what's the interest for the federal taxpayer? Now, fortunately, you got Governor Scott or Senator Scott and Senator Rubio. They're going to fight like hell and get the money. And they'll probably reverse that. But this has been a huge issue. There's another question that's even more pertinent, and that is, in coastal communities, I've heard this term managed retreat. And I said, well, there ain't nothing managed about it. We force the people that live there out, and we bring in all the tourists and rentals and secondary homes in. That's what's happening. But the question is, when do we stop investing in coastal areas that are no longer viable? Now, I'm not suggesting Pinellas County, but there are a lot of places in the state of Florida we know about that have been hit multiple. You know how many times in my career we have rebuilt the pier in Pensacola from hurricanes? And you kind of got to ask your question. Again, I got to go explain to Senator Tester from Montana why this is a good investment for his people's tax dollars coming down to our state to rebuild that pier. The other thing is, do you understand that FEMA only pays for uninsured losses? How many of your buildings are self-insured? FEMA treats that as an uninsured building. So we have transferred a lot of our risk, and this is not just Florida, a lot of states. We've transferred a lot of risk to the federal taxpayer that the private sector is no longer managing. So to get back to the issue on beaches, we need to really think about this from the standpoint of Florida. We just had a tremendous tax surplus, right? And we were giving tax breaks across the state like crazy, right? But what happened when the federal government, which is the federal taxpayer, says it's no longer the policy to re-nourish beaches for economic reasons? That doesn't mean the need goes away, right? How do we pay for that? And right now, yeah.
Perfectly happy to let us do it if we do it on our own dime.
That's the answer.
Well,
It's not the answer you want. But again, I'm trying to explain to you from the standpoint of the federal policymakers who are having to look at the cost of responding to disasters. This is a hard thing to convince. I can remember asking, this isn't just Florida. This is Alabama, Gulf Shores. This is Foley Island up in South Carolina. New Orleans ain't got beaches, and I'll beg to differ, Grand Isle, not even a good sandbar. But the Jersey Shore. You spent a couple $100 million putting sand back on the Jersey Shore that a couple of months later a northeaster took out. So you need to understand these as elected officials, that the days of somebody else always coming in is getting more and more difficult, and we need to rethink. And this may be, again, it's not going to be a popular answer, but it may be something that, yeah, I would expect that Florida generates a lot of sales tax revenue from Pinellas County, right?
amen.
So it would make sense for the state, if the federal dollars dried up, that this would be something the state should invest in, right?
You would think.
Well, if you go to the Florida legislature and says, hey, we want you to pay for our beaches, what's the answer going to be? So as long as somebody else is paying, the answer is yes. That's our problem. And that's why we haven't changed. And again, have you guys noticed we're getting more floods in places we never flooded before? This is the other thing. Last thing, and we'll do more questions. I got asked this question. I said, hey, I live in Florida. Do I need to buy flood insurance? I said, does your driver's license say Florida? They go, yeah. I said, you need to buy flood insurance. Why? What happened down in Fort Lauderdale? Fort Lauderdale a month ago. One thunderstorm. How much rain did they get? Could you imagine your communities when you're measuring thunderstorms in feet? Hell, in Alachua County, Gainesville, I've already got 8 inches, and we may set a record if it rains this weekend. Right? We are seeing more rain more frequently. So this term, 100-year flood, I remember I said we can't build for the past. Too many people build upon, I'm not in the flood zone. I'm like, unless you're in Walton County on top of the highest point in the state of Florida, you're in a flood zone. The problem is we have built our infrastructure, our zoning, and everything else upon this mythical 100-year flood event, which is occurring weekly. My favorite headline in the Washington Post last year was 5 1,000-year flood events at 5 weeks across the nation. Everybody, and I don't live in a special flood risk. I got flood insurance. My wife said, why do we got to have flood insurance? I'm like, the average impact of 1 inch of water in your home is $25,000 to $30,000. If you can get a contractor and supplies to rebuild it. And again, one home doesn't flood in these types of events. And your biggest vulnerability for financial resiliency in your communities are the ability of people to have insurance to cover their losses and repair their homes. Because if they can't repair their homes, this is something like, this is 2004. I've never heard this term before. You ever heard the term rattle payments? Because what happens when people are upside down in their mortgage, they have an impact or disaster losses their insurance won't cover. They can't live in their home. They can't make their payments. They mail their keys into their mortgage company. It's called a rattle payment. A rattle payment. Here, you can have the keys. What does that do to your tax base? So that's the last thing, is as much as possible, we need to encourage people. And yeah, it's not cheap, but look at how many places that are not in a special flood risk area that flooded during Ian. What did citizens do? I mean, I understand we are a non-woke state, but our legislature did something that's pretty woke. They passed a requirement that all citizen policies, whether you're in a special flood risk area or not, will have to purchase flood insurance phased in over the next couple of years. So think about it. Your biggest vulnerability for building resilience in extreme weather is lack of flood insurance throughout your community. Sir? Yep. Well, they'll find out when they start seeing it come in and they got to get flood insurance, or we'll buy it for you. Oh, yeah. That was earlier this year. It was one of these things that kind of like went under the radar. People in my world were like, "What? This is incredible." Everybody else will find out when they get it in their things. But the point is, how much of your community, if it floods, doesn't have flood insurance, would not come back and would potentially impact your tax base and your affordability of workforce housing? Commissioner?
So I've read our emergency operation plan, and when I read it, I feel like it's missing things.
Yep.
Given the changes that we're seeing. What do you see are the missing sections that we're going to do?
We plan for what we're capable of doing and hope the disaster fits it, and we always base
I've heard that line.
and we always base it upon our past events, not what's changed. You can debate climate change all you want to. The insurance industry's already voted. They're leaving. They're pulling out of writing new policies in California. They're increasingly, Florida's not the only one in the Gulf Coast that has an insurance crisis. Louisiana's right now. They can't even get regionals to come in there and write. But our problem is we've always based our plans upon past. We based it upon probabilistic events, and we never looked at worst case scenarios. We don't exercise to what I call MOM. MOM is the maximum. How bad could it be? I can remember in Alachua County, I was bringing up wildfire risk when I first got there. And I got told by everybody, we don't have a wildfire risk in Alachua County. In 1998, we tried to burn Waldo down and had to evacuate it. People changed their tune. But I was like asking the question, I said, what's there? Oh, that's never happened here. Until it did. So the thing you got to really do, again, this comes back on setting the expectations. You got to really push the professional staff out of their comfort zone. You got to really go ask them the questions they don't want to answer. And it isn't, the thing is, I don't have the resources. That's fine. We can't fix what we don't know.
Well, I will say, Mr. Fugate, I am from Gainesville, and I met him many years ago when I was a baby engineer working at the utility, and from John Reed. But anyway, the other thing that concerned me about the EMP is the time frame. Like, we're only going to, it only addresses like the first few days or couple of weeks after the disaster. The idea that somebody else is going to come in and take over. And I feel like some of our newer types of disasters, such as heat waves and things like that, can go on for a long time. And are you seeing a change in how counties manage disasters?
No, but these two will tell you, when I first got to the state in 1998, we ended up activating the state EOC for 202 days. We were dealing with strong El Nino. We had multiple floods. We had a tornado outbreak in Central Florida, killed 42 people. It stopped raining. We burnt the state down. Out of 67 counties, we no longer have the 68th county, Reedy Creek. We had 50 of the 67 counties under fire management grants, and then we ended up the year with Hurricane George. So while the goal of the plan is to get the emergency back into the org chart of government and shut down the EOC, they also need to understand that in certain events like COVID, it's an endurance. And again, your EOC doesn't, and I've told people this, the EOC doesn't have to run 24 hours a day. It could be just come in the mornings, we do the morning brief, everybody gets synced up, they go back to their stuff, but we all have the day plan. Because think about within county government, how many places do you have where everybody gets together to start their morning to make sure everybody's on the same page dealing with that crisis, even if they're not having to stay in the EOC all day? So that EOC is your convening authority. It's a very powerful tool, but ultimately, you want to migrate back to the normal organizational charts of government. And you may have to think about recovery is not generally going to be the strong suit of your emergency staff, particularly on the longer term economic issues, development issues that are beyond what they do. And you may want to look at, I may have to put together and go to the county manager or the county administrator, or if you're the mayor of the county, and put together a recovery that's focused on that long term. Because the thing I learned in county government, tax base, you live and die by. And if it doesn't come back, you're cutting services. At the same time, demand goes up. And I've seen this boomerang where you get a lot of sales tax revenue in rebuilding and people get an artificial sense that that's the new norm. I'm like, that's all non-reoccurring cash. Don't spend it on reoccurring stuff, capitalize stuff. Because you're going to go off the cliff. And the aftermath, if your tax base hasn't come back, this is what Mayor Landrieu had to deal with in Louisiana. 10 years after Katrina, he still did not have enough revenue coming in to pay for services and was still depending upon the rebuilding money for FEMA. And when that money ran out, they had about a 20% deficit in their budget. That was 10 years after Katrina. The Hurricane Andrew experience for Homestead, when they closed down the base, 10 years later, Homestead was still functionally bankrupt. It wasn't until they built the houses and tomato fields that their tax base came back. Sir?
Yes, sir. One of the things that we're doing, I'm from Bay County, I brought up to our attorneys, what I'd like to see is in urban and suburban areas, not allow the substandard trailer parks to go back. I wanted to just have modular homes built to today's standards, and so I'm getting pushback saying you can't do that. You can't stop because of the lobby from the mobile home factory.
Yep.
And so our attorneys are saying I can't do this. I was going to bring it up to try to move it forward, but they say it's a dead issue. It's already been challenged in court. What we're seeing is these mobile home parks that were blown away during Michael. They clean up. Now they're pulling back 60, 70 year. The trailers that were built in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they're setting back up in the same spots. We have the same problem that we had on home. And how do we, something like that, how can we address something like that?
Well, you're right. The manufactured housing lobby is very powerful, and the state pretty much preempts a lot of that. I'm just surprised because usually when the mobile home parks get wiped out, developers swoop in and put condos there. So that's usually what we saw. We saw this in Charlotte County where it's just after Hurricane Charley. Those mobile home parks, they just bottom out, redevelop, put heavier stuff in there. But it goes back to your zoning. And that's, I think, the only tool. And again, any commissioner who's ever been in a fight where you've told developers no, there's a political consequence, and they will run people against you every opportunity. And I've actually watched this where a county did the right thing, and in 3 years they had replaced enough of the county commissioners to reverse the decision. And you know where I'm talking about. I've seen it happen. So this is why this is hard to do these changes. And that's why this is not something people like to run on or talk about. But until the public demands it, you're fighting this thing about you're making homes unaffordable. My response is you're making them uninsurable. The price of home ownership is it an insurable property? And again, we've been in this dynamic long enough in the state, and I've watched these games, and I know Doug Buck and a bunch of other people that have flipped sides that will swear to God that our building codes are too stringent until there's a hurricane. Then they go praise our building codes, right? Then we hear, well, You can't tell me, that's my land, I should be able to build there. I got answers for you. I want to turn a lot of the coastal areas that are high risk into COBRA zones. Because there's this place in Florida called Dog Island. It's in a COBRA zone. I don't take away any property rights. You can build to your heart's content, whatever you want to out there. There will not be one federal dollar ever invested in responding to or recovering from Dog Island, except for maybe search and rescue operations. Yeah, there are places where it's become untenable. And creating these Coastal Barrier Resource Act areas. And again, the other thing is, not rebuilding doesn't have to mean you're losing tax base. Gainesville's got a good example of this. Gainesville made a decision early on that in the high flood risk areas, we got a lot of creeks and streams that on a day-to-day basis are not much more than a puddle in a ditch. But when it rains, become raging rivers. And Gainesville made a decision not to allow development in those areas. But rather than to let them sit there and developers eyeing it every day, they turned it into a system of parks, trails, and recreational activities. It adds value to the homes that are near that. And this is something I saw in Atlanta. It's incredible that sometimes buying out property in high-risk areas, but then turning it into recreational green space. I mean, how much of your budget goes for green space and trying to maintain recreational activities? And guess what? You can use federal money to buy out flood-prone areas and then turn that into green space.
That actually raises the value all around.
Yes.
And adds that more.
And this is the thing that I found. It's not subtraction. It's one of these things where it's taken away, adds value, and your property values go up. So there's this tendency to think, well, we got to put it back the way it was. You're going to fight developers every day. But part of this is explaining to the community why we need to do what we're doing. That when we're doing buyouts and other things and going, these are the high-risk areas, like, we're not just getting rid of it, folks. Guess what? We can put a golf course there, not the clubhouse. We can put in softball diamonds, not the rec center. We can put in all kinds of trails and recreational activities. We can have low-impact parks in there. We can have wildlife corridors. And all those things which add value to our community will actually increase our tax values. So it's not this zero-sum game that every time I take away property, I lose. If I'm just doing it willy-nilly, yeah. But this goes back to having that vision of what do I got? Where are things dicey? And like in Alachua County, we know there's some areas that are just, they're going to flood every time. We've had people, we were dry for so long, we had people build developments in dry lake beds. Boy, that was a real surprise in 1998. We had places all up and down Central Florida that were built in dry lake beds, and it flooded. They go, we got to pump the water out. We're like, that's the water table. We can pump all day. Ain't going down, folks. You built in a shallow lake that's been dry for 20 years, and some developer looked at that and says, prime development space. Talk to the people that have been around here for long enough, they'll go, why are you building in a lake? Well, it's dry. It won't be always. So that's, again, part of it's dealing with the response to disaster, but a lot of it is the policies, bringing that vision, and getting professional staff out of their comfort zone doing what they've always done, but also explaining to the community why we're having to make the decisions we're having to make. Ma'am?
In my district, I have every lake with one in our county. So I have these roads, and I know this is uncomfortable for people to talk about, but we have these developments that happen. There was no association in these roads, when it floods, and it always floods on these three roads. One, I remember them pulling the water in boats to get out from here. But each time it floods, these roads, we have to go in and fix them. Is there any way to get all of them right? Is there any way around this protocol where we could get some funding to make the repairs to the roads so that we don't have to face this every time? I guess these people, a lot of them, they're very poor.
Yep.
Places that have forestry on one side, which funnels the water
Yep.
All of us don't have that option. I mean,
You ain't gonna like my answer. The simple answer is, you have a board meeting, you get an ordinance written, and you make them a county road. And then you can go apply for infrastructure dollars and everything else to harden those roads and make them passable. But until you do that, it's a private road. And at that point, the question is, and this is, I mean, private roads have been, and private developments and gated communities have been biting our butts in Florida ever since we allowed them to happen. They want us to come in and clean up after disasters, but they don't want us there any other time. And they don't want anybody else in the community there any of the other time, right? They're keep out communities until they want your money. A lot of you have to have ordinances that say, because if you don't do this, you can't do it, that in a declared disaster, you'll go clear the road so you can get the fire trucks down the road, right? But you're prohibited from spending taxpayer dollars on private property, right? And that's what that private road is. So they can complain till they turn blue in the face. And there's not much you're going to do about it. Unless you want to bite the bullet and take it over. And then it's a public access road, which they may not be happy about. But that's the only way that you're going to be able to apply for the infrastructure grants, the billions that are sitting out there, that could actually do that. But until you do that, the only thing they could possibly do, and I don't even think this would be, again, I don't think they have the resource to do it. If they were an eligible nonprofit, they could maybe get the grant. But that's probably stretching it. And short of you taking it over, once you take it over, you own it. And that's been the whole thing about private roads.
So in Florida, I'm going to get Richard on this stuff, but when you want to buy out a home that's been repeatedly flooded, you can only give them 75%, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's a problem. I know others.
It is a problem.
Yeah.
But there's a big gaping loophole. Yeah, you can only get 75% from FEMA. And generally the homeowner's got to come up the other 25%, except community block grant dollars. Because your HUD dollars, guess what color they are when they get to the state of Florida? They become green state dollars. And we've done this. This is a history. This is
CDBGDR money?
no. These are your community block grant dollars, the annual appropriations. You can use that to provide the 25% buyout and administrative overhead. And this is not new. I had an opportunity to work, and these two will know, this will bring a smile back to Marcia's face. I worked with a woman who, she knew more about how to use federal money in ways the feds didn't know, called Charley Collins. And Charley was one of the first people after Hurricane Andrew to find out that all these different programs could do stuff that nobody ever thought they could do. And the thing she figured out, and her program administered through the flood insurance program, was using community block grant dollars through the housing programs to do the match, to do the buyouts. Yes. Yes.
So we have a road that's pretty famous when, I'm Castle County. Castle County was our guy. And every time we had a big rain event or hurricane in our area, Elfers Parkway went underwater, the governor paid this big hoopla, made lots of news stories. There are mobile homes built in a river swamp on the Angle River, and it doesn't take much for them to go underwater. Our challenge is and was, Kevin got us into that special program where it paid 100% of their value plus moving costs and down payment assistance. I think that's different than what you were talking about. But we could only, it's voluntary, we could only get about 20 residents that would take this because they can't replace what they have, so they wouldn't lose. So it's real problem.
Yeah, I mean, all these programs are voluntary. There's nothing we can do about it. What the flood insurance program will do, though, is they'll get to the point where it becomes mandatory, and if they don't take the buyout, they don't get flood insurance anymore.
Only if they have
repetitive. Yeah, but it always goes back to, well, if they don't need insurance, it's not a good deterrent. But that's the only real enforcement the feds have is after you've been offered a buyout and you refuse, you're just not going to get flood insurance. But for somebody who doesn't need insurance or will pay for it, it doesn't matter. Sir?
You mentioned the county taking over these roads. A lot of these private roads, landowner owns the middle of the road and has a mortgage that goes to the middle of the road. Can you address that? Is it the simplest taking it over, or does the mortgage
Yeah, that's a good question for attorneys, because you're going to basically have to go not only the road, but the right-of-way. And again, remember what you go through in establishing new county roads, what that takes. You'd be doing the same thing, so you'd be dealing with the, potentially you could do it through a condemnation, reverse indemnification, and you're going to pay. But again, this is not an easy thing to do. This is why I always told people, when you start putting in private roads that seem like an easy thing to do, it's got a long tail. And the people in those subdivisions say, I pay my county taxes. What the blank you mean you're not coming out here picking up debris? Well, you're a private road. So we had to go through, we ended up having to take a lot of money back in 2004 from hurricanes, where people did not have ordinances that gave them the responsibility to go pick it up. Because here's what FEMA pays for. FEMA doesn't pay you to do something because you want to do it. FEMA pays you because it's required activity that you're required to do. You're not required to go pick up debris on private roads. That's why FEMA wouldn't reimburse. Unless you have an ordinance that says that we're declaring an emergency, and for access for public health and fire trucks and emergency vehicles, we will pick up enough debris to get the roads open. But that doesn't include household debris and a whole bunch of other stuff they always complain about. So we built this mess. We're not getting out of it quickly. And you may need to think about it strategically. But again, this will be a big undertaking because of all the issues that are going to come up. Because it's not just the road itself, it's going to be right-of-way, maintenance, and all the additional future costs you're absorbing.
On that issue of private roads, other than a private neighborhood, but we pay a county tax for trash pickup, also the dirt pickup. So we have to run that discretion because sometimes it gets picked up. And the point was, we're paying for this payment. I understand maybe we're a low priority, but we still should be. So eventually
As far as FEMA is concerned, your fees are your trash pickup and routine debris. The extraordinary cost of picking up everything else is an unbudgeted, unfunded mandate that the county is not responsible for. Now, the homeowners association can tax themselves and pay for it. But when you want the federal taxpayer to pay for it, the county commission has to be obligated to spend local money. Because think about it, you're getting reimbursed. And everybody thinks, well, it's FEMA money. No, it's your taxpayer dollar. FEMA ain't got no money. It's your taxpayer dollars. But FEMA can only reimburse for what you as a county commission have obligations to pay on a daily basis. It doesn't just change because you're doing disaster. That's like with overtime. You have your senior folks that are probably professional salary staff. And then in a disaster, they're working 7 days a week, 12, 14-hour days. We want to pay them overtime. And FEMA will reimburse for overtime, so you try to pay them overtime. Guess what? Unless you have in your county charter, in your ordinances, that in states of emergencies, at the direction of the chair, you pay overtime not contingent upon reimbursement from FEMA. You can't pay them overtime, even though FEMA would reimburse it. So again, always think about this. FEMA pays for what you're legally obligated to pay, and in a disaster, that doesn't change. You can't create new things you're obligated to pay with the taxpayers' money just because FEMA will reimburse for it. So that's why you got to have ordinances for going on private roads for emergency purposes. That's why you got to have overtime policies in there. Oh, you want to waive tipping fees and get FEMA to pay for it? FEMA doesn't pay for lost revenue. You waive the tipping fees, you waive permitting fees, FEMA doesn't reimburse for that. If you call in mutual aid or you're paying overtime, FEMA will reimburse for that. They won't reimburse for lost revenue. But again, think about it from the federal taxpayers. People say, well, that ain't fair. I'm like, disasters aren't fair, folks. And Congress wrote the law very specifically not to take care of everything. This is a shared responsibility. But you can only get reimbursed when the president has declared a disaster at the governor's request and you're in that area and for public assistance. And then you can only get reimbursed for uninsured losses and for those things that you're obligated to do. And if you look at 252, you're obligated to do a lot. But things like overtime for salary staff, that's not an obligation if you don't pay it on a routine basis during declared emergencies. Going on private roads, making repairs, picking up debris, that is not reimbursable. because that's not a routine activity unless you have an ordinance that says, in emergencies, under very specific conditions, do you pick up that debris.
But in those two examples, you're saying we can establish.
Yeah,
Will they be reimbursed?
absolutely. Because FEMA looks at us and says, you got an ordinance that says you got to do it, it's reimbursable. But think about your professional staff that are salary and go through a disaster, and trust me, these two made more money in hurricanes than I did. Because they got overtime, I didn't. Well, actually, you were part of the, you were up there a little bit too high. But we had staff that got overtime. And we actually, Governor Bush started realizing, and he basically raised it to bureau chiefs. But I didn't get any overtime. But it got so bad that we had agencies that their staff that were deployed were making as much money as the secretary was making. So this is a morale issue. And remember what General Milligan said, you take care of your folks. And that's my last thing. Meet the needs of your survivors, take care of your team, and when all else fails, the third rule is to see the first rule. But don't forget your team, because they're going to put in long hours, they're going to deal with stuff they've never dealt with, they're going to get burnt out, and things like making sure that you have clear policies, and again, do this ahead of time. I've run into a county, got a little bit of noise about some favoritism and some contracting. Make sure you feed your folks and provide them coffee. That's reimbursable. But some places are so cheap, they say, well, that's why they got a salary. They can go buy that stuff. Well, in the EOC, I don't want them having to go out and find something to eat and go get coffee. Make sure they got good working conditions. But the best thing you can do is always make sure you show up on the bad days when they're there, because presence is a mission. Eric?
All right,